Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the BGVP Scale Pro. So we are going to go through this one super quick just because there's not a whole lot of interest in the set. It kind of came out, was released. People said, look, there's a new BGVP set out. And that was about the extent of the interest in this guy. So this is the Pro version. The normal scale actually has two dynamic drivers. So I think maybe the dynamic driver, that 10 millimeter, is the same one in the regular one, but in the Pro, there is a balanced armature, which you can kind of see right there. So that is the difference between the two. This one is they're both hybrids, but this one is a dynamic driver and a balanced armature 1+1. So the cable is kind of stringy and tangles a lot, and the box is okay. So let's jump straight into it. The good part of this one, it's actually a nice affordable V-shaped 1+1. And it's done well for V-shaped fans. If you are not a V-shaped fan, skip this one. This one is a big V-shape. It would only make sense to people who like V-shaped sounds. The average part of it doesn't really go beyond one dynamic driver in performance. It's a 1+1, so you can't expect miracles, but compared to other $20 one dynamic driver sets, it's kind of right there at the same level of performance, maybe even a little behind. It just doesn't really go beyond much, even with a balanced armature. So the bad, it definitely has a graph problem and a source problem. So the graph problem we'll look at real quick. It's just a hard graph to look at because you just see mid bass. It's all mid bass. There's mids at this little point, and then this part is actually pretty good, but it's very, very hard to look at this graph and think that this is actually going to sound pretty good. And it sounds a lot better than what it looks. But again, there's a source problem, and this sounds really good on a more expensive source, on one that has a nice amp section to it. So just straight out of your phone, it kind of sounds like it looks. So I think to recommend this set, I think people are just going to look up the graph and say there's no chance that whatever anyone says about this set being okay or good is going to happen with a graph like that. So again, we're going to go through this one quickly because most people aren't going to get past that graph. The source problem is just as I said. You really need a pretty nice source with a nice amp for this one to actually sound pretty good. Otherwise, it sounds a little close in, a little too intimate, a little too small, a little too shouty. It definitely takes on a very different character straight out of your phone or even on an underpowered dongle. So, you have this problem of, and I talk about it there, so we'll talk about that in a second. So the sound, definitely a fun, engaging, balanced V. I think I do like it as a V-shaped set. It's actually quite fun and engaging. I listened to it for quite a while. It's definitely a fun set. You get this warm dynamic driver low end on the bass, and that sort of cut across with that BA in the upper end through extension, and it actually extends pretty good. So they sort of got the that part of the tuning right, how to mix the two together to sound like a fun, engaging set. They actually did that pretty good. But like I said, a better source is a much better experience on this guy. It's a $25 IEM that sounds good on a $100 source, and ultimately that is going to be a big problem for this set. Is people are going to plug it into their phones and say you were totally wrong about this set, it sounds not so good. So trust me, it sounds good on a really expensive source. On your phone it probably sounds as bad as everyone else says it. So I like it because I plugged it into a nicer source, and it definitely paired well with nicer sources. So again, just really hard to recommend a set like this that is really very source picky. So the bass, again, if you look at the graph, could very much have been a disaster with a lesser driver and source. This driver actually does hold together pretty good, even with that bass level. The source kind of a little more power, kind of tightens it up a little bit. It clearly could have been a huge disaster if you just look at that graph. Still a very healthy amount of mid-bass warmth. It's kind of huge and thick. Not as boomy and bloated as it looks or as I expected just looking at the graph. And again, everyone's going to look at the graph and say there's just no way, but with a better source it sounds okay. Definitely a good amount of control and definition with the right source, and that really saves the mids. It definitely will go boom if you need it to go boom. And a track like Harry Styles' Golden, it's sort of just a bit too thick, but it was actually passable, and it's just a tons of fun amount of bass if that's Again, you are a V-shape fan, you like tons of mid bass. This was pretty much a signature for you. The mids, again, could have been very much a V-shaped, very recessed, really far back mids under a bloated bass, but it actually works pretty well because they've got a dynamic driver and a balanced armature. And like I said, that balanced armature does give you enough lift right there in a treble, so actually things sound a little more clear than you're expecting them to sound, a little less muddy than you're expecting them to sound, and they did something right. It's just that the graph doesn't look all that right, but when you actually listen to it with the right source, a little more clarity than expected. Another example of hybrid tuning that works in a big V shape without over pushing those upper mids. And it's not too bad considering the amount of bass they've got right here. Most people or most brands would have actually pushed this beyond 9 dB or whatever it is right now. It's probably at 9 or 10. They probably would have gone to 12 or 13, and this whole thing would have been pushed way out of place. But they kind of stuck to their guns and left it at 9 or 10, and I think that was the right move on this guy. Definitely at the lower end of the mids, you get that weighty male vocal, something like Joe Nichols, Sonny and 75. His deep vocals and just enough rise with enough dynamics so over a very thumping beat, so that mid bass hits you pretty hard, but his voice has enough dynamics there, so it sounds pretty reasonable. Definitely having a thump with a corresponding boosted 2 to 4K works here to cut right across the bass. And like I said, they sort of got this part right, and I don't know how they actually got it right, considering I don't know if the same person did this piece and this piece, but somehow these two actually work together and sound a little more reasonable than it appears. So the upper end, the female vocals, not shouty, but not hybrid advantage coming through. And that's kind of where I said this one doesn't quite go too much beyond a one dynamic driver. And you really hear it in the female vocals. They sound okay, but you're really not hearing that detail and texture in the female vocals that you really should be getting out of a hybrid set with some balanced armatures. It's kind of okay for the price is what I would call it. Mainly, you're definitely helped a little bit by that bass keeping the mids a little cleaner than expected. And again, trust me, you're going to look at the graph and say there's no way that mids sound clean at all, but yeah, they kind of do. Treble, and I think the levels actually work here as well. It's kind of more like a dynamic driver with a bit of extra on top for balance, and that's kind of how these dynamic drivers and the BA work in this set. Not too much to sound metallic, but just enough there to keep things a little clean and clearer than they would be with probably the normal scale with two dynamic drivers. Again, the bass could easily have masked the upper treble, and it actually comes through here, and even comes through with the stage height. I think that somehow there's a miracle that happened with this set, and the upper treble doesn't really get masked, and there's enough height in the stage. I don't know how it all worked, but somehow a miracle was performed on this set. So the stage, definitely, like I said, better source, better stage. On a dongle on your phone, the stage is actually kind of small, and right there on your face, it's kind of no good. Give it some amplification, and everything opens up. You actually get just beyond the ears, nice height. The bass doesn't mask the imaging as much as it could. This bigger space really helps the mids sound a little more cleaner and clearer, like I said. And it also shows off kind of the limited resolution of the balanced armature. So everything opens up a little bit with a better source. And where you're expecting, like I said, in these female vocals, where you're expecting to hear a little more detail, a little more texture to those voices, a little more resolution. This one you basically just are hearing a limitation of the one balanced armature. So that was a quick one on the BGVP Scale Pro. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.